Okay, I'd suggest we slowly get started for the next session. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Matt Kisner from the University of South Carolina, where he's currently chair of the Department of Philosophy. Matt has been working extensively on early modern philosophy, focusing on moral concepts such as freedom, happiness, the self, the good life, and perhaps most importantly, for this occasion, the passions. He has written or edited 4 books on Spinoza, most recently Spinoza on Free Will in the Cambridge Element series. And with that, Matt has published almost as many books on Spinoza as Spinoza has published books. But today he will be talking on morality's compass, the wisdom of the passions in early modern moral philosophy. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so is this working? This works? Okay. I want to thank Therese and Gretchen and all the organizers for this conference, and especially Notre Dame. I feel so spoiled by this conference. I feel like I will never be able to go to a normal conference again. It's really nice. So the moral value of the passions has been a perennial subject of philosophical debate since antiquity. And the Orthodox Christian view has been that the passions are indispensable for leading a virtuous life. So, of course, the passions can be excessive, they can be disordered, and then become a sin, the source of sin and vice. But nevertheless, you need the passions in order to be virtuous. However, there's a change that happens in the way that the passions get defended in the early modern period. So prior to the early modern period, if you look at like Augustine and Aquinas, the passions primarily have what I'll call motivational moral value. So they derive their moral value from the fact that they're constitutive of virtuous motives. So virtuous people will act from the love of God, or they will act from the love of their neighbor. Once you get to the early modern period, you start to see this increase in prominence of a different kind of moral value that the passions are supposed to have. And this is that the passions have a cognitive value. So the passions are now taken to be informative. They inform us about moral value and moral standards. So passions like indignation, approbation, praise and blame, these sorts of emotions are supposed to tell us, reveal to us what is morally valuable and what the moral standards are. So that's a real change. So with Augustine and Aquinas, the passions, they can be good or bad depending upon their object. So the passions themselves are not going to tell you what's good or bad. The bad passions, if directed to the bad object, the good object, you don't know from the passions. But on this new view, where they have cognitive value, suddenly the passions, they can reveal to you what's right or wrong or what's good or bad. So I call this the compass conception of the passions, where they play this role of providing you knowledge, or information at least. And I want to clarify one thing there. Saying that the passions are a source of information about value, that does not imply that the passions are cognitive, that they are representational. It doesn't even imply that they're intentional. So you could think about like a volcano erupting. A volcano is not a representational state, it's not an intentional state, but it can still be an important source of information. It can tell us, you know, what the temperature of the Earth's crust is or something like that. So the idea is that the passions are like this source of information that doesn't require that the passions be contentful or representational states in any way. So this view really takes off in the 18th century with moral sentimentalism, and it continues today. So we still have moral sentimentalists today, and then we have meta-ethical views today that really resemble this view. So I'm not actually going to make the case in this paper that this important change happened. I'm not committed to saying that there wasn't anything like a compass conception prior to the early modern period. It's fine if there was. I just think that if it was, it wasn't as prominent. I'm curious to hear later on if people disagree about the compass conceptions becoming more prominent in the early modern period, but that's just my foregrounding. What I instead want to focus on is why this conception of the passions became so prominent in the early modern period. What were the motivations? What were the routes that led people to start to conceive of the passions in this way? And so in the paper, I have 3 different routes to the compass conception that I outline. And the most obvious route, I'm thinking I'm probably not going to talk about. If I do, it'll be at the end. So I'll just flag it at the beginning. The most obvious route I'll call the meta-ethical route. And this is the one you would probably would first come to mind when you think about this view and you associate it with like the moral sentimentalist tradition. So I'm interested in the 17th century, before this view really takes off, when it's kind of inchoate and really developing. And at that time, the best exponent of it would be Hobbes. And so basically the meta-ethical view is just that moral judgments themselves, somehow they're expressions of emotion, or they're claims that are justified on the basis of emotions or something like that. And that makes the emotions themselves really the source of our moral judgments, and consequently the source of our knowledge of moral value and moral standards. So that's the obvious one. Not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm more interested in these other 2 routes, because I feel like less attention is paid to those and they're less obvious. And in particular, I think there's certain kinds of grand narratives people are prone to that make these 2 routes kind of obscure and hard to see. And so I call these the naturalistic route and the metaphysical route. And the naturalistic route is represented by Descartes, and the metaphysical route is represented by Spinoza. So let's get started with the naturalistic route. So the big picture here is that Descartes explains the passions using the emerging modern natural science as these systems for directing us to our natural ends. And so part of that explanation is that the passions are mental representations of the value of things for attaining our natural ends. Well, it turns out that some of our natural ends are also moral ends. Virtue is a natural end. And so that entails that the passions also provide representations of what is valuable for attaining our moral ends, or at least some of them do. So that's the big picture that I want to argue for in the case of Descartes. Now, the issue with this is that this reading of Descartes I'm advancing is strongly teleological. And it's a controversial claim. You could see from Amy's paper, like many people think very differently from this. So I think that to make this claim, I have to do a little bit of work to set the stage for why I think this teleological reading of Descartes is the right reading to have. So let me just start with the term teleological. So this is an anachronistic term. We use it all the time, but it's not a term that Descartes ever used. So when I apply this term to Descartes, I need to be very clear about precisely what I mean by that term and why that's an accurate description of the view that Descartes in fact holds. So this is how and I feel like debates on these kinds of things get lost because people aren't always clear about what these terms mean. So this is what I mean by teleological. Something is teleological if it is end-directed. We can assess whether something is end-directed by whether it is subject to evaluations of success or failure. So if I have some activity or something that I try, and you can say accurately that I succeeded or failed, then that was end-directed and it's teleological. So you can use this to describe a natural system or a natural thing. So let's say the circulatory system. If I say that the circulatory system failed or succeeded with respect to promoting the survival of my body, then I have made a teleological ascription. I've said that the thing is end-directed. If it's accurate to say that it failed in this thing, then it's accurate to say that it was teleological. Derivatively, you can say that an explanation is teleological. And an explanation is teleological if the content of that explanation ascribes end-directedness or teleology to something in it. So if I were to explain the shape of the stomach by appealing to its end of digesting food or something like that, then that would count as a teleological explanation. Okay, and I'm going to use the term in that way consistently as we go through with both Descartes and Spinoza, where this will come up. Okay, so what's Descartes think about teleology? So it's a very common view to think that Descartes hates teleology. People want to say, the early modern period, that's where they turn away from teleology, and then they want to lay that at Descartes' doorstep. I think this is a big mistake, but where did they get this from? Well, it's from his criticism of final causes. So I want to say something about final causes. So in Aristotle, a final cause is a fundamental form of explanation that appeals to a thing's ends. So for Aristotle, the notion of a final cause is basically identical to the notion of teleology as a teleological explanation if I've just given it. They're just synonyms in Aristotle. But the problem is that final causation gets taken up by a scholastic tradition, which then provides it with a new meaning and a new interpretation. And in this system, a final cause is also a divine purpose. So final causes are things that are given to things by God, purposes in creation. That then changes the meaning of final causation so that final causation is no longer just a synonym for teleology. It's a very particular kind of teleology that's actually very, very loaded. And so we have to keep in mind when Descartes is talking about final causes, we need to look, what does he mean? Does he mean the kind of final causation that's a synonym for teleology, or is he instead talking about a very specific form of final causation? Okay, so let's look at Descartes' main criticisms of final causes, and these are on your handout. So A1 on the first page. I consider the customary search for final causes to be totally useless in physics. There's considerable rashness in thinking myself capable of investigating the impenetrable purposes of God. Okay, so a couple things to notice here. Firstly, it's only explanations in physics that he's targeting here, right? It's not all teleological explanations, it's just final causes in physics. And the reason that he's giving is because we can't know God's purposes. So this is clearly targeted at a scholastic conception of final causes as involving divine purposes. Okay, the second quote indicates a second line of argument. So he says, what makes it especially clear that my idea of gravity was taken largely from the idea I had of the mind is the fact that I thought the gravity carried bodies towards the center of the earth as if it had some knowledge of the center within itself. For this surely could not happen without knowledge, and there can be any knowledge except in a mind. Okay, so this is the worry that teleological explanations ascribe mind-like intentional properties to inanimate things, which they don't actually have. So once again, what's being criticized here is teleology in a very particular context. It's in explanations in physics. It's limited to that. And it's also would only be explanations that impute to inanimate things human-like intentions, desires, and human-like behaviors. Would seem to allow for the kind of teleology that you have in Aristotle, where objects have all kinds of appetitive natures without having human-like intentions. Okay, now you might respond to all of this by saying, but wait, Matt, you're saying that this is just limited to certain kinds of explanations in physics, but there's this great passage where he says he wants to banish final causes from all of his philosophy. So this is 3. When dealing with natural things, we will then never derive any explanations from the purposes which God or nature may have had in view when creating them, and we shall entirely banish from our philosophy the search for final causes, for we should not be so arrogant as to suppose that we can share in God's plans. Okay, so yes, this passage says it's not just physics, it's the entire philosophy, no final causes anywhere, but once again, attend to how he's talking about final causation here. The worry is that we don't have access to God's causes. We don't have access to God's purposes in creating things. So it's once again, what's being banished is the conception of final causation that involves divine planning. Okay, so I don't see that there's evidence for him completely ruling out teleology per se. And on the other hand, there's a lot of teleological explanations that he does provide. So in his ethics, he's a eudaimonist. So he thinks that humans have a final end, which is happiness or virtue. In his conception of good and evil, these, I think, are strongly teleological. So he defines good as what's beneficial to us, evil as what is harmful. And I think whether something is beneficial or harmful can only be assessed with regard to some end. And Descartes thinks that benefit or harm should be assessed according to our natural ends. So he judges what is beneficial or harmful according to the agreement of things with our nature. So he says we call something good or evil if our internal sense or our reason make us judge it agreeable or contrary to our nature. Okay, but most importantly, his account of the passions is teleological. So he holds that all things have natural functions, usually usage, which he describes as aiming towards natural ends, most notably the survival of the mind-body composite. And Descartes uses this natural function to then explain the passions. So, quote, their natural function is to move the soul to consent and contribute to actions which may serve to preserve the body or render it in some way more perfect. So for instance, the passion of fear has the function of moving the soul to avoid dangerous things. The passion of love has the function of moving the soul to seek out beneficial things. So how do the passions serve this function? How do they move the soul? They do so by representing things as good or evil, the concupiscible passions, or representing the prospects for encountering or obtaining some good or evil. So for instance, he claims that fear represents death as evil, as does repulsion, while he claims that attraction represents its object as good, and that despair represents objects of desire as unattainable. Okay, we're now in a position to begin to see glimmers of the compass claim in Descartes. So the compass claim is that they provide us with information about moral value, and Descartes' account of the passions implies that the passions inform us of value, specifically the value of things with respect to these natural ends. But we still need to do more work, because so far the only end that we've really seen is the end of survival, right? So I see how fear keeps me away from bears, and desire makes me eat food or have sex, and these are good things for my organism to survive. But what does that have to do with virtue, right? What does that have to do with moral ends? So we need to understand more about what these ends are to which the passions direct us. It seems like if the passions are only directed to survival, they would provide very poor moral guidance. And Descartes himself acknowledges this. So Descartes has two worries about the passions' moral value. So the first one is because the passions alert us as to the condition of our body, they tend to overestimate the value of bodily goods. So they misrepresent value by overestimating bodily stuff. So he writes, all our passions represent to us the goods to whose pursuit they impel us as being greater than they really are. Okay. The second problem is that the passions fail to evaluate good or bad with respect to what is within our control or under our power. So, quote, the error we commit most commonly in respect of desires is failure to distinguish adequately the things which depend wholly on us from those which do not depend on us at all. So, for example, desiring things beyond our control is pointless and problematic because it disturbs our mind and undermines our happiness. And yet we do it. I desire things beyond my control constantly. So this is a common problem with the passions. Okay, that makes it look like the passions might be moral guides. However, Descartes recognizes that there are other ends to which the passions direct us besides bodily survival. And these other ends include virtue. So Descartes defines virtue as properly directing your will. Quote, a firm and constant will to bring about everything we judge to be the best and to use all the power of our intellect in judging well. So achieving virtue means directing the will only to the goods within your control, not to just all the goods. So in Descartes' words, the exercise of virtue comes to the same as the possession of all those goods whose acquisition depends upon our free will. So Descartes holds that some passions do direct us properly to only the goods within our control. He distinguishes the function of the passions insofar as they belong to the body, that's his language, and insofar as they belong to the soul. When the passions serve that latter function, they don't represent the good only with respect to things like bodily survival, but moreover, they take account of the good of the entire person, including the good of the soul. And when they serve this function, Descartes claims that the passions cannot be too great. So that usual shortcoming of the passions, of them being too powerful and overcoming or misrepresenting value, that doesn't apply when they serve this second function. And this is because these passions are based on knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of what is genuinely beneficial or harmful to our nature, including the knowledge that virtue is our natural end and that it requires directing ourselves only to goods within our control. So these passions, based on the knowledge of what benefits our nature, serve the compass function by representing moral value, representing value with respect to the end of virtue. The morally good desires direct us to what is beneficial to the end of virtue, and the morally good joys delight in attaining that end. So for instance, the morally good desires do not include the ambition for the praise of others, something that's beyond our control. And the good joys do not include delighting in the praise of others. Descartes' primary example of a morally good passion is, of course, generosity, which is the basis for the virtue of generosity, the cardinal virtue of Descartes' ethics. And it's a kind of wonder, a kind of esteem directed at our own will. This passion represents moral good and evil because it recognizes the value of the will and its proper direction. Indeed, generosity provides a corrective to the bad passions that represent good and evil without taking account of what is under our control. So it tempers the bad passions. Thus, generosity and the passions that have been corrected through generosity under its influence serve the compass function by representing value appropriately to the end of virtue. Okay, so that's the Descartes story. That's the naturalistic route. Now the second route, the metaphysical route, which we find in Spinoza. Like the naturalistic route, the metaphysical route is based on the notion that our passions direct us to natural ends that coincide with moral ends. However, whereas Descartes' naturalistic route employs natural philosophy to explain the passion's natural ends, the metaphysical route uses metaphysics. So the metaphysical route is taken by Spinoza, whose thinking on the passions was highly influenced by Descartes. This view tends to conceive of the passions as a kind of moral thermometer, a thermometer of our moral perfection, and consequently a source of information about the moral value of things for increasing or decreasing our perfection. Okay, so as with my reading of Descartes, this is a teleological reading because it supposes that there's this end-directedness. And as with Descartes, Spinoza's views on teleology are also controversial. And this is because of Spinoza's apparent criticisms of teleology, most famously in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. There he asserts, people are unwilling to accept his conception of God because of prejudices. Quote, now all the prejudices that I undertake to expose here depend upon a single one, that human beings commonly suppose that like themselves, all natural things act for a purpose. Okay, now it's tempting to read that statement as ruling out all teleological explanation. And this reading finds some support in the fact that Spinoza also rejects final causes. So he writes, nature has no purpose laid down for it, and all final causes are human fancies. However, close examination shows that Spinoza's criticisms, like Descartes', are more narrowly targeted. Spinoza is not clearly denying teleology per se, for his criticisms themselves recognize that some things are indirected, namely human beings. The prejudice is supposing that natural things act like we do for ends. So the object of his criticism is not that things have ends, we have them, but rather that we can ascribe human end-seeking behavior to non-human things. That is, that we can explain non-human things as acting like humans do. Put simply, the object of Spinoza's criticism is anthropomorphism, not teleology. Anthropomorphism concerns Spinoza because ascribing human motivations to non-human things leads us to imagine that God is a person, creating things and endowing them with purposes in the same way that human beings create artifacts. So when he says that nature, capital N, does not act with ends in view, this is what he means. He means that nature doesn't have these divine purposes within itself. He's not saying that all of the things in nature don't have ends. Spinoza regards that conception of God as a personal creator making things like artifacts as a fundamental prejudice because it prevents people from accepting his alternative, impersonal conception of God. So Spinoza's criticism of anthropomorphism leads him to reject final causes because the scholastic tradition conceived of final causes as divine purposes. Thus, Spinoza follows Descartes in rejecting final causes because they suppose divine purposes. Though Spinoza's opposition is even stronger than Descartes'. Descartes held that God's purposes are unknown and consequently unavailable for scientific explanation. He was fine with the idea that they have divine purposes. We just don't know them. Spinoza's is stronger. He thinks that they don't actually have divine purposes. It's not just an epistemic barrier. Okay. So Spinoza's criticisms of anthropomorphism do not rule out the existence of natural ends, provided that they meet two criteria. First, the natural ends of non-human things can't be explained anthropomorphically. And secondly, natural ends cannot be explained in terms of divine purposes. But this does not rule out the possibility of teleology wholesale. An obvious example is Aristotle, the original pre-Christian Aristotle, who had a thoroughly teleological outlook but denied the Stoic and Platonic commitment to divine purposes and planning. Okay, so Spinoza offers precisely such a teleological theory in his theory of conatus. Okay, so conatus, striving or endeavor, is the essence of all final things. This entails that all things have an appetitive nature. All things strive or try necessarily in virtue of what they are. This striving is directed at ends. It is striving for something, namely self-preservation. Consequently, the striving meets my definition of teleological because the striving is susceptible to evaluations of failure or success. A thing can fail in its striving, for instance, when it fails to preserve itself. Indeed, Spinoza holds that succeeding in one's striving is virtue, an evaluation of success. Conversely, he holds that people whose striving is overpowered by contrary forces, like the melancholy or people who commit suicide, they are, according to Spinoza, weak and vicious, which are evaluations of failure. So Spinoza's teleological metaphysics provides a different route to the compass claim. It can be summarized roughly as follows. Spinoza uses conatus as the basis for explaining the emotions, which implies that the emotions are directed to human natural ends. Since these same human ends are ethical ends, it follows that the emotions are oriented towards ethical ends, which confers them with the compass function. So to fill in the details of this view, I just need to explain a little bit about how Spinoza uses conatus as the basis for his theory of the emotions. Okay, so Spinoza categorizes all affects, and now I'm going to switch from using the word passions to emotions. The reason is that in Descartes, as is often the case, passions tends to be the big category word for describing all affects or emotions. But in Spinoza, it doesn't work that way. In Spinoza, passions refers to a problematic subcategory of emotions. So that we are comparing apples to apples, we have to change our language in Spinoza. So now we're talking about emotions or affects. Okay, so he explains each of these three categories. There's three kinds: joy, sorrow, desire. All emotions can be reduced to one of those three categories. He explains each one in terms of our conatus, our striving. So desires are basically instances of our striving. So Spinoza defines desires as appetite accompanied by the consciousness thereof. Thus, desire is a kind of appetite, or perhaps identical to appetite. He defines appetite, in turn, as our striving related to mind and body together. So according to Spinoza's parallelism doctrine, the striving is expressed at both the mental level and the bodily level. At the mental level, all things exist as ideas, which are parallel and identical to bodies. Thus, Spinoza regards appetites and desires as particular expressions of this striving, both in a thing's body and in the corresponding ideas. So according to this definition, any time a thing strives to preserve in existence, to seek out beneficial things, to shun harmful things, appetites and desires are those bodily movements and their corresponding ideas. So this encompasses what we would usually think of as desires. It also means that there's a ton of things he qualifies as desires that we would never think of as a desire. So any movement in your body which is an expression of your striving, like the beating of your heart, for Spinoza, that's a desire by this definition. And then the idea of that in your mind is also like a mental desire. So it's super expansive. But it does include everything we usually think of as desire, but there's more. Okay, Spinoza also explains the other two categories, joy and sadness, in terms of conatus. So power of acting, potentia agendi, is an important term for him. He never strictly defines it, but basically it's his preferred term for describing the strength of your conatus. So conatus is a power that is directed to not just preserving itself, but also increasing itself. So we strive to increase our power. So as our striving succeeds, it grows. And as that power grows, he says our power of acting, our potentia agendi, increases. And when our conatus is unsuccessful, then our potentia agendi decreases. Thus, power of acting is also a teleological notion because it expresses the conatus's degree of success. When you succeed in your striving, it becomes more powerful and your power of acting increases. And so Spinoza then defines emotions, and by this he means joys and sorrows, as fluctuations in that potentia agendi. So, quote, by emotion I mean affections of the body by which the body's power of action is augmented or diminished, assisted or restrained, and at the same time the idea of these affections. So in other words, emotions are transitions or changes in your potentia agendi. They're transitions in the success of your striving, and then also transitions to a state of greater or lesser perfection, because that's what it means for Spinoza to increase your striving. You're increasing in your perfection. Okay, so now that we have Spinoza's rough theory of the motions in view, we can consider how that's related to his moral philosophy. Okay, Spinoza's ethics, like Descartes', is broadly eudaimonistic. Spinoza uses the conatus theory to explain both the ends that people actually do take, as well as the normative ends that people should take, including virtue. So Spinoza writes that, quote, the striving to preserve oneself is the first and only foundation of virtue. This means that our striving for self-preservation is a virtue and is the basis for all other virtues. More specifically, our striving is best realized by using reason, because this involves conceiving adequate ideas, which most increases our power. Reason, in turn, dictates to us rules for living, what Spinoza calls dictates of reason or laws of one's own nature. And these laws include what is traditionally conceived of as virtuous ethical prescriptions. For instance, to want nothing for oneself that one does not desire for all human beings, to avoid pride, to acquire a generous character, to have friendly relations, and so forth. For Spinoza, virtuous people best succeed in their striving, strengthening their conatus and allowing it to guide their actions, while the vicious are those whose conatus is weak and who are led by external powers. Okay, so this discussion now shows how Spinoza is led to the compass claim. So we've seen that our emotions are forms of our striving, which set our ethical ends. This leads Spinoza to conceive of the emotions as both directing us to and tracking our ethical ends. So to illustrate, let's first consider joy and sorrow, and those operate a little bit differently than desire does. So according to Spinoza, virtuous action realizes my striving and strengthens my power of acting, which entails that performing these actions will give me joy. Conversely, vicious actions must cause sadness because they're contrary to my striving and decrease my power. In other words, joy and sadness serve as a kind of thermometer of one's power and one's perfection. Consequently, these emotions also provide information about how one's actions affect one's perfection and well-being. Since our ethical goal is increasing our power and perfection, it follows that these emotions also provide feedback on our moral status, our state of perfection and our state of virtue, and how our actions and things in our environment contribute to that moral status. Okay, that's true of joy and sorrow, right? They go up and down and it tells us how we're doing virtuously. But what about desire? Does desire for Spinoza have the same compass power as joy and sorrow? Well, unlike joy and sorrow, desire does not indicate the status of our perfection. Doesn't tell us whether we're powerful or not, or virtuous. Nevertheless, desire is still a form or instance of our striving. So it is directed to what will, or what we imagine will, increase our power and perfection. Consequently, desire provides some information about what promotes our virtue. The fact that we desire something implies that we strive for it, which provides some reason to think that the thing will increase our power and consequently our virtue. However, desire is not a super reliable information about what increases our virtue. Spinoza distinguishes between active and passive desires. So the passive desires would count as passions for him, and the active desires would be emotions that aren't passions. So the active desires are desires that arise entirely from our konatus, entirely from our active powers, whereas the passive desires come about partly from external things acting on us. So they're the more traditional, passively affected affection. So according to Spinoza, active desires are pure expressions of our striving, and consequently they're necessarily directed to what increases our virtue and perfection. Passive desires, however, are not. So consequently, we cannot look to desires per se for reliable information about what's good for us or not. We can't just say, oh, I desire it, it must be good. It doesn't work that way. However, if we can tune out the passions, get rid of the passive desires and just focus on the active ones, those are reliable. Those will actually direct us to what genuinely is beneficial to us. So those would provide a good moral compass. And it's worth pointing out here, this plays an important role in how people actually live for Spinoza. So if you're not looking to your emotions for moral guidance, then you would be usually looking to reason. But Spinoza's account of reason is highly abstract. Reason is these things called adequate ideas, which don't represent any particular features of things. So reason will give you like really general principles, like act to increase your power. But then you're like, well, how do I increase my power? Like, what do I do? In this situation, I'm encountering this person. How am I supposed to interact with this person? Is this person going to increase or decrease my power? And their reason provides astonishingly little guidance, because it's so abstract in general, it can't give you that fine-grained particular detail. But the emotions can. Active desires then can fill this role of informing you about the practical details of situations that are sort of invisible to the power of reason. So it turns out the emotions provide this very particular and important kind of intelligence for, in Spinoza, for practical reasoning that you don't just get from reason per se. Okay, and I promised myself I would finish at 11:40, so I'm not going to talk anymore about Hobbes, but you have a bunch of quotes on your handout, and if you want to talk about them in the Q&A, I'm happy to go there. Thank you.